Welcome, everyone. I'm Michael Horn and thrilled to have you all joining us today for this AEI webinar about this new book, School Rethink 2.0, that Rick Hess, Julie Squire, and I collaborated together to edit. And the origins of this book, just briefly, for those that don't know, were that Rick had written a book about rethinking practices in school. I had written From Reopen to Reinvent. Julie had written a series of well-regarded white papers for Bellwether around how do you assemble bespoke education in a very different age. And all of us were thinking about different aspects of the rethinking or reinventing, if you will, of schooling. And we said, we really got to go to the front lines with people who actually know something about the work on the ground and have an edited volume where they all contribute their hard-worn lessons from actually being on the ground with educators implementing some of the innovations that we all were talking about. And so today we have a terrific lineup of three of those authors of chapters in the book. First, we have Kristen DiCerbo. She is the Chief Learning Officer at Khan Academy, wrote a terrific chapter around the topic du jour, if you will, of AI in education, which we're going to hear a lot more about shortly. We have Scott Ellis, the CEO of MasteryTrack, who I think has the sharpest thinking around mastery-based learning out there. And so Scott wrote a chapter around that for us. And then we have Beth Rabbitt, the CEO of the Learning Accelerator, who's been on the ground with districts and lots of the actors, frankly, that have been creating changes toward personalizing learning in a variety of dimensions, which we're going to hear about today. And so we really have the all-star lineup, I think, my favorite folks who touch really this aspect of personalization in a number of aspects together. And also joining us, John Bailey, my longtime friend, non-resident senior fellow at American Enterprise Institute, among many other titles that John holds. And John is going to play the role as we have this panel conversation of provocateur, if you will, every once in a while responding or injecting maybe some global thoughts about the conversation that the three of us or the three authors are having around these topics. So at 4:45, we'll open it up to Q&A. But as you have questions, don't be shy about dropping them into the Twitter hashtag or sending the email so that we can collect them and start to pile them up to engage when we get to that point. But with that, we have two of you at South by Southwest EDU this week, including Kristen DiCerbo from Khan Academy. Kristen, you, Sal, and Rachel all collaborated on this fascinating chapter on AI that opens the book. And maybe before we get into some of the central things that you talk about, the chapter is focused significantly on your personal experience with Khanmigo, right? Which is billed as Khan Academy's AI-powered teaching assistant. There's something powerful in that language that we'll come back to in the future question. But maybe before we get into, sort of the content of what you learned and some of the hard-won lessons or practical lessons that you talk about in the book, just update us. Like, a lot has taken place since you wrote the chapter. It probably feels a little antiquated to you at the speed that things are moving. So just give us the update of where Khanmigo is at the moment, number of schools and districts and students serving. What have you learned about its impact? Things that maybe you wish you had a redo on the chapter, stuff like that.
Absolutely. Thanks, Michael, first for inviting us to contribute to the book, and for having me here today. And thanks to everyone for joining. And it is the case that the speed of AI and the speed of publishing are not the same. It does feel like, oh gosh, there's some things we can talk about. But in the spirit of rethink, I want to point to two things that have happened since we've kind of written the chapter that I think are interesting. And one is around rethinking maybe what writing instruction looks like, and then starting to rethink maybe what some assessment might look like in the world of AI. So in the writing front, we have been working on this writing coach where the AI can walk students through the writing process, from thinking about, do you understand this assignment, to writing an outline, to drafting. And then the AI, we have worked to make it so it can give feedback on the introduction. And we've really focused on, what should the introduction do in this paragraph? How does it capture a reader's attention? How does it state your thesis? Then evidence and arguments, and then thinking about structure and tone and style. and giving students this, ability to revise and get feedback. Because fundamentally, when you think about writing instruction, so often it's the teacher assigns a writing, the student kind of works through it on their own, turns it in, the teacher ends up with a stack like this to grade. They're spending their evenings and weekends. The student doesn't get any feedback until 7, 10 days later. They maybe look at the grade and put it away. But that's not the type of immediate feedback and scaffolding that we know is important for any kind of learning. So we're excited about maybe using AI to rethink what writing might look like. And not to make a product push, but I will say last week we released Writing Coach for free to any teacher in the US who wants to use it with their classroom. So feel free to check that out if you are looking at that. And then the second way we are thinking and just starting to think about what might a conversational assessment look like. If you think about what a teacher does when they sit next to a student and say like, well, show me how you did that. Why did you do that there? What does that look like? What if you could have a conversation with AI that looks like that? And we are just wrapping up a pilot in about 13 different schools across the country where we've tried out some of that. Obviously, we're in a formative assessment space, not a high stakes space, but thinking about what it might look like and could we get better information to teachers and to parents about what students can do if we expanded what we are doing beyond our traditional multiple choice and what that looks like. So that's a little bit of some things that have happened since we are there. We are excited to have reached our point where we have 1 million students and teachers using Conmigo. So that's a big milestone for us. About half of those are in our district programs and about half of those are independent learners. So it's an interesting balance to see what those two different types are using us for and what they're doing. Our teacher tools, we see that teachers are using us for lesson planning. They're using us for better or for worse, to write multiple choice questions is one of their favorite tools. And also, interestingly, we launched a partnership with Bluekit. If folks are familiar with Bluekit, where you can use Conmigo to write Bluekit questions, and teachers have really been using that quite a bit as well. So it's been interesting to see what teachers are choosing to use us for and what that looks like. So that's a little bit of what we're up to.
Very cool. John, I want to bring you in the conversation. I should note before I do that I have two kids sick at home, and I think both were on Conmigo today, doing some computer science, if I'm not mistaken. So
Oh, gosh.
they've been having fun with that. But John, sort of like you've been studying the question of AI in education, frankly, AI and the large language models, the frontier models, from a global perspective on this. Put Conmigo in context, perhaps, for us and the broader set of changes that you're observing in the AI education ecosystem right now.
No, it's great. The work that Kristen is doing and leading, with SalCon is inspirational, and it's just uncharted territory. And I know from talking with Kristen too, the other thing is it's exhausting because like usually like a technology like this comes out and you get a couple months to, develop around it, to experiment with it, test it, roll it out, get feedback. And one of the challenges, and this is the great joy that we're living in right now with AI, is that these models keep improving, and just new capabilities come out at an astonishing pace. And so it's really hard to develop for it. And I know one of the things that they're building right now, and I think this is going to be the year you're going to hear a lot more about multimodal AI. And that's, right now the most experience that everyone's been having with these systems is you text something to it and it texts back. And that's a great experience. But what you're beginning to see are these new models where you can talk to it and it can respond back with very, very human-like responses. Some models that people probably are not as familiar with, one is Hume. There's another one that just got released this week called Sesame. And it's so eerily lifelike in the way that it can talk back to you. And it analyzes your voice patterns. And so it knows, if there's hints of anxiety or anger or frustration, and it can be programmed to kind of respond appropriately. And if you think about that, that's an amazing set of building blocks that we have for tutors now, where now all of a sudden tutors can talk to you and you can talk to it. That opens up assessment opportunities. And the new next generation of that is going to be AI that sees you. And you see that with vision understanding that's coming out through Google Gemini, a very, very early maturity model with ChatGPT. But again, if you play that out over the maturity curve, it just means in 2 years, you'll have an AI that can be trained on the best of learning sciences, on the most rigorous types of pedagogy and curriculum and in high quality instructional materials. It could be trained to be the smartest tutor in a bunch of different ways, Socratic and all the ways Kristen was saying. We could also do that in a way that it's talking to you, it's seeing you and responding to you kind of appropriately. And so I think it's like the work Kristen and Connor are doing are just really paving the way, but we're so early in this Gen AI wave. And I think that's what's exciting is that I think a lot of what I keep hearing is critiques, from some critics on Conmigo and just AI tutoring generally. Um, may be right if you're giving them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, but I think you're going to see these models improving so rapidly, bringing in new capabilities that will make these a really, really powerful tools and just helping students. The other thing that I just want to drill down on something Kristen was saying too. It's not just like a tutor, it's like an assistant, it's a feedback. Like I think we need new language to describe kind of the ways that these systems are going to be showing up in the lives of students and teachers too, where sometimes it's going to be tutoring, sometimes it might be giving them feedback, sometimes it's just in time coaching, and I don't quite know what that is because that's not like sort of a role in a school right now, but we'll probably need some new language around that.
I'm going to totally deviate based on what you just said there, John, in terms of the plan that we had for the panel and pull Beth in here because it just relates super strongly to some stuff she wrote about. First, what you're describing obviously is disruptive innovation 101, right? The technology starts out as primitive compared to the best, but it starts in places where the alternative is nothing and it gets better over time, and everyone always discounts the improvement trajectory of it. But Beth, and something John just said about like marrying this with high quality instructional materials, thinking about the language of what are these different roles, like that relates to a lot of the points you made in your chapter and part of your chapter around personalization of like sort of busting these false dichotomies that people hold in the field right now, where they're like, high quality instructional materials, personalization is anathema to that. Not really. And so maybe talk about that and play it out a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely not. In fact, an argument I make is high quality instructional materials are necessary for personalization, and personalization is actually totally necessary to using those materials well. In the chapter, I talk a bit, heavily about like personalization is the ability for us within the context of like mass delivery to actually understand and meet the needs of unique individuals. And so we did go through a period where, personalized learning, capital P, capital L, was sort of like equated as a model of technology that was highly individualizing. But personalization has been an aim of like our field for a very long time. And I think as we think about AI in particular as one tool amongst potentially many that educators will use to personalize, there's sort of like two challenges. One is being super clear on like what we are trying to do for learners and why, and using the evidence that we have gained before about what can work and what doesn't work in service of these like new and emerging tools, right? So grounding in the science, but also grounding in what we actually want to accomplish. Was talking with a district leader who's making choice about AI right now. In his context, he's like, I actually don't want tools that are going to remove the cognitive lift from the teacher in knowing what questions to ask, because we know that the more teachers know students, the better they're able to actually address needs. And I think that's one example of like, we have to hold a North Star vision of like what we think quality looks like. The second thing we need to do though, and we are actually running a national network of school teams using AI right now, is like, are we looking out far enough in defining that quality and being open to the new ways of working that might allow us to meet those aims that aren't just about replicating our strategies of the present? So to John's point, saying what are the teacher roles? What are the expert roles that we could have in the future that are enabled, that could help us get at individual needs much better than the current role, which is where we ask one person to do everything and are trying to create assistance for, right? How are we using time differently? Are we willing to actually let students work in different ways and in different places and spaces because that makes sense for them? And so there's a challenge that educators face, which is like, how do I do what I know can work? And how can tech help me, while also holding the secondary, which is, and what are the things that are holding me back in this moment that are being made possible through new tools and ways of working?
Perfect. So Scott, let me bring you into the conversation around mastery. There's Kristen in the lead up to this was noting sort of, I mean, Khan Academy has made mastery sort of the underpinning, right, of a lot of this movement. And mastery has been something that you've been super passionate and about and pushing in some specific ways to make implementation actually work on the ground. It's interesting because one of the central promises of tutoring was, yes, you could really get to know a student and personalize for them, but also that you can make sure that they mastered whatever they were working on before they were progressing. And it was these concepts all coming together in the form of tutoring that was so critical, I think, to the vision. And that's where you obviously enter the equation. First, maybe high level, give our audience a sense of what you built actually out of the Learning Accelerator. You worked with Beth and MasteryTrack that you developed. Give us a sense of what it is, what it does, and where it is today.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, for me, it's just very exciting to hear these conversations. Sometimes I feel like a little bit of a fuddy-duddy where I'm still stuck on, let's make sure we actually have the underlying infrastructure for mastery learning really happening. And it's so exciting to see that happening more and more, because so much of what we're really talking about is automation. And how do we make things happen faster and better and smoother? And often what's really important in automation is to make sure we're not skipping steps and we have the underlying infrastructure clear. And so for me, my guiding vision, and really it has been for like the last almost 15 years of my work in education, is how do we help enable students to move forward at their own pace as they master content? And personalization is part of that, using real-time data, but it's really about being clear, what is it we want the learners to know and be able to do? And I often say that as educators, we've kind of been mushy in our thinking really for generations about, wait, what exactly is the learning objective? And we have standards, which certainly are helpful, but a lot of them are vague. And increasingly, I'm working not just with schools, but with organizations. And if I'm asking a CEO, so for this new training plan, what do you want your sales managers to know? And I get deer in the headlights look. And so step one is clarity. What do we want the learner to know and be able to do? Step two is what I call a mastery threshold. So what does success mean? How do we know if they've learned it? And then we clarify, how do they demonstrate that? And how do we determine whether that's right? Are they taking a test? Are they doing a presentation? What's happening? And then some way of organizing and displaying the data. And my belief, as the years have passed and we've built up the technology infrastructure, and I remember going to a classroom implementing Khan Academy in 2012, and that's what got me started on this whole journey. And 60 Minutes was there to see this amazing new thing and seeing what's possible. But as we've gotten the technology in place, internet connectivity, devices, support for teachers, the idea of a station rotation or a flipped classroom is no longer brand new. My belief has been, if educators and students and principals and parents can see with the single click of a mouse button where the students are in their learning, then we can unleash all of it. But we need to have the data so we know where they are. And so I built MasteryTrack, around 2015, 2016, with the goal to create what I call a mastery dashboard, so that we can actually see, here are all the students, here are all the learning objectives, and here's the current mastery status of every learner. Because if you have that information, now we're ready for education to begin. I mean, in my view, the way 21st century education should work is we build that architecture, right? What do we want the learners to know and be able to do? What does success mean? And then we start by gathering the data to say, what do the students know right now? And then once we have that information, now the educator can say, I know myself as an educator, why am I a teacher? What am I good at? What are my strengths? Then I know these students who are with me and what's going on in their lives and how do they learn and what they need to know next. And then I can develop my plan, which is, how am I going to use the precious resource we have, which is teaching time and learning time, to help these students learn as much as possible. And then we implement the learning, and then we check and see where we are. and now what learning has occurred, and we decide what to do next. And so MasteryTrack was designed to do that. I built it as a standardized platform. And on one hand, it was very successful. Tens of thousands of students used it. I had all kinds of courses and all kinds of contexts. And the revolution wasn't here yet. And so I really pushed it as far as I could, I thought at the time. And then for the last several years, I helped my son get into college and spent time doing other things. But I also did a lot of volunteer consulting for nonprofit CEOs and other organizations. And more of my consulting projects turned into projects about mastery learning. And so I was implementing mastery learning with the Red Cross. I've been working with nonprofit executives doing training for their C-suite executives. This week was working on building out MasteryTrack for bridge, and I'm going to start MasteryTrack for pickleball. And the reality is, it's how do we help learners learn at their own speed as they master content? This is not just about K-12, it's about individual schools and organizations, and it's about clarity. And most importantly, we measure learning, we don't measure teaching, and that's how we change the world.
All right, we're not going to make this a fight about pickleball and tennis. We'll instead talk about progressions, about how one leads into the other. But Kristen, let's bring you back into the conversation here. And you can start to engage, I think, with a lot of the points that both Scott and Beth were making, but also Scott just talked about the role of the teacher in that equation. You all have very clear language, right, about the teaching assistant Conmigo, focusing on helping teachers save time and enabling them to do what they do best. I suspect there's a lot of downstream implications of that that are actually quite important. So I'd love you actually just to riff on that as well, and like why that framing, because my guess is when people think about AI tutoring, that's not the prism through which they're coming into that conversation, or that's not the mental model that they're using. So having you talk through that, I think, would be great.
Absolutely. I was just making a note of our next Khan Academy course on bridge, but we'll get there. So I think that as we started with Conmigo, we had, I think, 4 or 5 activities for teachers. And every time we showed it to a group of teachers, they would say like, oh, could it help me write rubrics? Oh, could it help me unpack these standards, as Scott said, that are sometimes dense and hard to, could it help me unpack those into learning objectives? And just kept giving us ideas and ideas and ideas about what Conmigo could do to help them. And so a lot of what we see from teachers, as I said, the idea of lesson planning and generating a lesson plan is one of the most commonly used things we see. And it is because teachers spend a ton of time out searching the web for ideas for how to teach this a little bit differently, and how to, what else could I do to grab that student attention and to really spark their curiosity and think about what could happen. And so the idea behind all of this is not that Conmigo is an expert teacher, but that Conmigo can be an assistant to the teacher, and that what we have built is also helping them engage in good pedagogical practice. So it's easy. You can go to ChatGPT and say, make me a lesson plan, and it'll make you a lesson plan. It's not going to be a good lesson plan. And so like we took a rubric used in the teacher preparation programs about what makes a good lesson plan, and we worked on Conmigo's lesson plan output until it met proficient status on that rubric for teachers about what makes a good lesson plan. And so I think for teachers, there's this idea of how can we help them not just save time, but also be better teachers and engage in good pedagogical practice and what that looks like. So we don't have the other interesting thing is when you talk about saving time, it's not that easy to measure that. You have to rely on teachers to kind of give you hey, how much time did you save? I'll give you an estimate. So it's kind of survey data and it's not great, but lots of our anecdotal reports from teachers are very positive about, you've saved me my weekends. You've saved me, just the ability to not have to spend my whole weekend doing this kind of administrative work that comes along with teaching, and I'm able to do this. So that's the idea behind what we're trying to do on the teacher side, which is not just about AI tutoring and that piece of it, but all of those other things. So like I said, we have write an exit ticket, help me write a rubric, all of those kinds of things that teachers do that we can maybe help them with.
I'm loving that you're pulling that up because the saving time, if a tool doesn't do that, it's dead on arrival, right? And we've seen so many great ideas in the world of ed tech that would be great if they just used them right, but it adds like more work or the value proposition isn't immediately clear. And so the save time seems to me critical for this to really take off. Scott, let me come back to you on this because that relates to implementation and support. You have this anecdote at the beginning of your chapter about this implementation of MasteryTrack in a New York elementary school. And the quote from the assistant principal 3 weeks into implementation, where she says, "Your system is causing hysteria in our school." And you're like, "Oh my God, what have I done wrong?" And then she follows up with, "It's actually not your system or the infrastructure, MasteryTrack. It's great. It's just like we had assumed that students knew all these things, but they actually don't." And then that's sort of like a key item in your chapter, right? Is that there's got to be a shared understanding around what are they implementing? What are they trying to achieve? Some agreements on like, what are they trying to mastery? What is mastery? And how would we know, right? And so take us through some of that nitty gritty of the importance of agreement on what the outcomes are and what you're trying to actually know, because and also frankly, the time spills out from there. If you don't have clarity around there, you're going to be chasing a lot of ghosts for a while, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing I think we all need to remember is that when we all grew up and we were in school, we didn't usually get mastery learning. I mean, if we were in some custom tutoring program, we might have gotten some kind of learning that was at our own pace, but largely that's not how we learned. That's not how the teachers in our schools learned. That's not how the parents learned. And all of us obviously are very, very focused on how our kids are doing. And so if a principal comes to a community and says, okay, we're going to do this differently, and I'm not going to use the word transformational because then I really scare everybody, but we all know that's what's happening. We need to realize that all of us are in uncharted territory. Now, the exciting thing is it's much more known than it was 10 years ago. And so people are getting more familiar with it. But step one is to remember this is new, this is different. And then, yes, I was very shocked when I had that conversation with this very lovely elementary school educator who said, yeah, you're like, the kids don't want to come to school. They don't want to do math. And I said, oh no. And part of it was, he said, we thought they knew this, but the other part was the kids did things like they didn't read the instructions on the assessment. And so it was a subtraction question and they added, or they didn't check their work and they made silly mistakes. And so in talking with the educator, I said, look, the way the system's designed, yes, there are automatic assessments because, again, the goal is to save teachers time. And so, yes, we can have AI and computers in general help with things like automated grading, which saves time. However, we also set it up so the teacher could override it. And I said, look, if you think that the kids know it and they just made a silly mistake and you think that they're okay, just mark them green because you guys can say, yes, we've got it. But if it's important to you that they read the instructions and it's important to you that they check their work, and you think that these are some of the things we want the students to know and be able to do, then you need to tell them that this is the case and then do some more instruction. And then they do need to take the assessment again when they're ready, because again, there's no failure in mastery learning. They just haven't mastered it yet, but they do actually need to get 9 out of 10 right within the time limit, or it's going to be purple again, and then mother and father may be unhappy again. And so it does come to this reframing. One of the things we also did was the principal did a lot of work talking to parents, teachers, and kids about what we were doing. There's no such thing as failure. This is different. And everybody still freaked out when they didn't do great the first time around. And so I told the principal, you're going to have to double down and in some ways say, okay, I have your attention now. Let's try this again. What we're doing is different. There's no such thing as failure. And to the students, now you've seen what happens if you don't read the instructions and don't check your work. And so then when they went through it again, I called the assistant principal back about a month later and said, how's it going? And she said, everything's great. Everybody calm down. It turns out when you tell the kids to read the instructions and to check their work that they do that. And guess what? They did get most of them right. And the other thing we found is there are very real gaps in their learning, and we never would have found them if we didn't have this level of detail. And so it's absolutely important to clarify. And that's the one word I use. It's about clarity. What do we want the student to know and be able to do, including, do you want them to check their work? What do we want them to do? And what does success mean? And that's the structure. And then the communication. For the kids, because at first the kids won't believe you when they say there's no such thing as failure. They won't believe you when they say, no, it's not about how much homework you did tonight. We're not doing that anymore. What we're doing is, have you mastered the learning objective? And here's what it means. And then we need to make sure this is clear to parents so that they understand, first of all, what's happening and they're comfortable, but then to see they have a very valuable role to play, and they can play it better than ever because they don't understand the state standard, Common Core 4.3 point whatever, but they do understand multiply a 1-digit number times a 2-digit number. And if parents can understand, they can support the process, they can help their kids. And these are the kind of things that help make this work better, because it is transformational. And at some level, it's not really rocket science, and it's happening more and more, but we've got to do these things right to make implementation successful.
So Beth, let me bring you in here because you talk a lot about practical practices that enable personalization in the chapter. And you have this line around systematically building capacity with the long-term view, and also about how if personalization is at odds with the underlying system, it's not going to be successful. In light of what you just heard from Kristen and Scott, love you to unpack that notion a little bit more, and like how you make these things swimming together as opposed to discombobulated and the opposite of coherent.
Yeah. So innovation, I mean, a big role that TLA plays is just studying and trying to understand innovation and supporting its scale and its sustainability. And it can be incredibly fragile. You know, we have all visited the school where the one leader, like the leader Scott is describing, is like, we're going with mastery-based learning. And they implement, and then that leader is pulled to a district or someplace else, and it all goes away. And so getting over some of that fragility, what we have found requires moving beyond here's the thing we're implementing, whether it be an AI assistant or mastery-based infrastructure, which is sort of how we think about it at TLA. Mastery-based infrastructure does not guarantee personalization in any way, shape, or form. You got to use it and to inform where you need to personalize and how. But if you don't have infrastructure, if you don't have the right tools that make it easy to do, because we have to remember that educators are most likely to change behavior when they believe they can actually implement the thing and it will benefit their students, right? And so if we don't address some of those factors around whatever we're trying to bring into the system, we're sunk. We have studied systems where they have pursued personalization longer term, and the number one thing that actually holds the strand across disruption and so forth is actually the vision for learning. And saying, you know, I like to talk about Lindsay Unified, which is a school district in California. They were on the brink of actually needing to do a turnaround because of their students were primarily kids of migrant farm workers who had multilingual learning needs and so forth. And I said, we're not giving our kids what they need to achieve in the world. And so as a community, we got to define what we want this to look like. And personalization became a core part of the vision and the purpose of education. And so with that, even through changes, that's the thing that has allowed them to drive change over the last 15 years. And so what we really need is like the vision starts first. We can talk about the tools and technologies that make it easier, and we need to talk about the infrastructure upon which everything lies, like mastery or competency or proficiency or whatever. And then we can start using those things to really systematically do personalization in ways where we're putting kids in different groups. We're giving them opportunities to go deep in subjects they're really passionate about. We're understanding what makes learning relevant and motivating, which is a major part of what helps kids learn. And all of those pieces are made possible by kind of systemic support structure and a vision that is different from where we are today.
Yeah, John, I was gonna say, you want to jump in here. I'd love like your sort of global perspective on some of this. And I'm just thinking about the change management, right? And how much this is about people also on the ground.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. It's totally about people. It always has been about people. And, you know, there's always, you know, I mean, Michael, this goes back to your roots in Clay Christensen, that it's one thing to have an amazing piece of technology, even multiple pieces of technology. The the thing that dampens all of that, and really at the end of the day makes that technology work or not work, is people and people change. Um, and systems change. It's a little bit of what Scott was saying too about with mastery and with helping to support kind of this new way of thinking. In the past, we've always done that with like some crude sort of professional development. We've always done that with some other kind of consulting help. And that's important. I don't want to like diminish that or dismiss that. But it does feel like if we're really going to kind of unlock, I think, some of these opportunities and what, is so compellingly laid out in the book, and the visions for that, it all goes back to like people and systems change. It also makes me wonder if there's like some ways of using AI in that space. Like I think we get so oriented around AI as a tutor. Like maybe this is AI as like a learning coach for the teachers and for the administrators. And maybe it's a little bit of helping them sort of think through this and having a little like an assistant that can help them, inch their way into some of these new models and this new approach and that new thinking. And, in doing that, like also you get exposed to the tech and you get exposed to AI and you get a little sense of how that might be powerfully, kind of used in other facets. It's also a little lower risk, right? Because if, you counter some of the rough edges with a student, that's a big deal. Kristen knows that firsthand. But, if there's some rough edges as you're trying to like roll this out with some teachers as a teaching assistant or a Beth Rabbitt assistant, like that's like, I don't know. I mean, people are a little bit more forgiving and that kind of like surfaces things a little bit too. So, but I totally, I mean, the systems change. It's also the reason why I think AI is going to be one of the most powerful technologies we've ever seen kind of introduced into society. And it's still going to take years for that to work its way through the education system. And some of that is because of bureaucracy. Some of that is red tape. Some of that is just the way we've structured institutions. But it's also going back to kind of the people and the systems change that, is needed to complement all this.
Yeah, so not about the tech for tech's sake. Let's run through this then. It's a perfect segue, John, to the last topic before we open it up to Q&A. And Beth, I'll have you start on this, and then Scott, just jump right in, and Kristen, you just jump right in after that, rather than me playing the role of intermediary. We'll try to make it feel like we're actually together. Beth, you have a whole series of lessons learned in the chapter, right? Around what not to do, things that we could have said. You're walking like with a blindfold on right back into a trap we've already tried. I suspect you all have learned, I know you all have learned a lot from the work you've done at TLA on the ground. Maybe share some of that. And then Scott, you can talk about some of the tripwires you've seen in implementing, and Kristen, both in building Conmigo, but also then in implementing some of what you have learned about what not to do.
There is so much learning that has happened. Yeah, I mean, a couple that things that come to mind are, and we've touched on this, and John has touched on this too, is like focusing on how the technology, sometimes we get so focused on what the technology can do, we forget that it's actually about like what the humans can do. And so when we have a picture of what we want for teaching and learning and we throw tech in, we have to remember like when we put kids on technology or ask teachers to use technology, we are taking away time that they could be spending on other important things, even if it's saving, right? And so I think of one of the early lessons for me in a blended learning school was, we said like, oh, great, the technology can help us differentiate to multilingual learners. We had through kids on Duolingo, we offered them text in different phrases. And then we realized we had completely forgotten that a huge part of learning is dialogue with peers and hearing other people talk about problems and perspectives. And by adding one thing in, we actually took away what was potentially a much richer learning experience from learners. So keeping it all in balance is the major lesson. The second, and this point has been made, our adults need to experience what we're asking them to implement with kids. And none of our teacher training structures or even the resources we're giving folks are actually aligned with that right now. So when we ask like, oh, why is it so hard to implement? It's really hard to implement something you can't see or feel yourself. I think the last thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately as it relates to personalization is education might be the only tool where we or only field where we insist that every tool be perfect for 100% of kids. And I would argue like in a personalized world, we probably should be focusing on like developing a whole bunch of 5% solutions that are awesome at solving those problems we can't figure out how to solve for kids, and starting there rather than saying, oh, this doesn't work for everyone. I think we have to focus on those needs that are highest in our communities, those places where we keep failing again and again, and focus there with our new tools. Because if we have a whole bunch of like better 5% strategies, we can support learners in whole new ways versus like assuming one tool is just going to solve every problem.
I agree with all of those items, of course. So appreciate so much of that. The things that I've experienced that I think about a lot are, first, just the reality that we're in a system overall that is not mastery based. The system we're in now is based on letter grades and seat time and so forth. That doesn't mean we can't do mastery learning, but figuring out how to bring it to life while still meeting the needs of the existing overarching system is very important. I remember working with one district, or one school very early on, and pretty quick in our work, they said, oh, maybe we should just get rid of the district benchmark assessments and use MasteryTrack. And I said, no, this is too new. It's too innovative. You need to make sure that you continue to succeed as measured by the current system. But the good news is you can run this somewhat in parallel and make it part of the learning process. So you're going to change how you do teaching and learning, and you're going to be doing that anyway. But the good news is before the students take the standardized test as required on March 13th, you know how they're going to do. And you can actually be looking at this a couple months in advance in great detail to help them be more successful. And it's not about succeeding on the test, it's about increasing learning. But just realize that we are living in a system that's not mastery based, and find ways, and in some cases, small ways, to do it in parallel. And then the second piece is just to make sure we come back to that one word, clarity, and not underestimating how vague we've been as educators in defining what we want students to know and be able to do, and how problematic in some cases the existing standards, et cetera, are, because they're not clear and specific. And we haven't defined a kind of a binary threshold of, are you ready to move on or not? Have you gotten it or not? And so encouraging people to really continue to push for clarity about those learning objectives and definitions of mastery.
Yeah. We feel the pressure every day of that mismatch between mastery systems, where kids on Khan Academy are trying to get more skills to proficient, and someone needs to put a number in a grade book that is a percentage score of something. So, oh, we feel that. But in terms of some of the other things that we've learned, I think if I said this, you would all be like, of course, that's obvious. You can't lead with the technology. But we have yet again learned that lesson. And we've seen two kinds of districts come to us looking for Conmigo. One who says, our problem is, for instance, math achievement. We want to use your content with your AI to help solve this problem. The other type of district says, we need AI. And we hear Conmigo is great. Let's use Conmigo. Guess which district sees better usage and better outcomes? District A. They had a learning problem to solve and thought that maybe AI could help with it, as opposed to thinking they had a technology problem to solve. So again, sounds obvious, but we clearly have not learned the lesson yet, because it's repeating itself. So I'm going to keep saying it. So that was one. And the other is, not surprisingly, so I've done a lot of reading of chat transcripts lately of kids interacting with Conmigo. Let me tell you, kids are not great at asking questions. That's a skill that not a lot of kids have. And so I see a lot of IDK, huh? What? Like, and so again, probably obvious to teachers in classrooms, but thinking about how do we help kids become better question askers? How do we help teachers, and how can teachers play a role in thinking about student curiosity and how to ask questions and what that looks like? On the other side, we have, some a science teacher in the Newark School District who literally printed out a card of question starters that kids could use with Conmigo. So it's like this mix of the old laminated card on a desk with like how to talk to Conmigo. So I think there's also some lessons about, combining the tools that we have to get to the outcomes we want.
I'm not sure if I feel better or worse about the fact that I've been investing the last year of my reading of trying to become a better question asker myself, because I feel like I'm deficient in that area. But this has been great. This has been great. Let's start to go to audience questions. Before I do, I want to just also plus one, Beth, your point about, as opposed to trying to find tools that work for 100%, let's find a lot of 5% solutions. I said this once in a special needs commission where they were trying, I'm all for universal design for learning. And sometimes those principles actually work against each other because they create cognitive overload for certain students when you have multiple channels working. And so maybe labeling, this is really good for learners with this affect or challenge, and this is not good for these would be a better way forward. But that aside, my pet peeve. Let me ask this first question. And it's an interesting one. I think Kristen and John, you'll both have perspectives on this maybe, which is, have you all seen any instances of AI in education or AI ed tech where it actually hasn't saved time? And if you don't have specific examples, that's fine. But like, what does that look like where maybe we're using AI and it's not saving time, if that makes sense?
Since Kristen, you want to go first?
I'm trying to, I'm kind of scrolling through where things are. I think where, even if you think about tutoring, if a student has an idea of how to solve a problem, they should start trying to solve the problem as opposed to engaging in a conversation with the AI. Like there's some pretty good, cognitive science research. And I'm like, you should ask yourself, do I have an idea of how to do this or not? If you have an idea, you should try to do it. And if you don't, then you should be seeking help and looking at that. And so I think even there, we can see it's not saving time if students are spending a lot of time in these conversations and are actually losing practice opportunities. I point a lot to this paper by Ken Koeniger at Carnegie Mellon that's about they've found across millions of students in tens of different platforms, the number of opportunities to practice you need to learn are pretty consistent. And we need to make sure kids are getting those opportunities. And if it turns out that they're spending all this time on one problem while they're interacting with the AI, that's actually going to be a loss. And so we think a lot about how much that trade-off between opportunity to practice and the conversations that students have with AI. So that's what immediately comes to mind when you're thinking about, does it save time? John,
Yeah,
do you have thoughts?
No, I mean, just maybe two thoughts on this. One is one, if like the AI, whatever the set of the tools is one more thing on top of everything else, because then, I think we've seen from some of those learn reports, like the average teacher's engaging, I mean, hundreds in some cases, apps and systems. And I mean, if it's just one more thing, it's not saving time. It's actually adding complexity. Also, it's hard sometimes to guide the output of these to be precise. And so sometimes you could see, I find this even with myself, that you're giving the same prompt several times in order to get a better improved response that kind of aligns with whatever you want. You see this a lot with the image generators. Like if I said, I need a picture of a school building with a lot of kids with the blackboard, and like you'll have to do that a bunch of different times to get kind of the aesthetic and the type that you want. And so sometimes like you're so busy doing that multiple times to get the AI systems to generate what you want that you could be wasting your time there and not saving time. That's going to get smoothed out, I think, especially as AI finds itself in a lot of tools that are already more polished and aligned with what teachers need. Like as this gets deployed, not going to ChatGPT, but as it gets deployed through Google Classroom, like it'll be better, I think. But I do worry, like in the early innings of this, there's a lot of risk of wasting time just trying to get it to like work in the way you want it to work.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's also where people have observed these tools, at least at first, are better with expert learners than perhaps
Yeah.
novices who sort of maybe spin on some of these things, right? Let me ask this question, and Beth, I want to go to you on this one, which is around balancing the need for, quote, standardization in education, e.g. curriculum and assessments, with the flexibility required for, they wrote personalized learning, I'm going to say personalization, but would love you to bust through that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately this is the challenge, right? Is that if we want to deliver something consistently with quality to kids, as many children as possible, right? Like we need standardization. This is true in the medical field as well. Like oftentimes we don't actually look at other fields, but there are fields like medicine where this is also the challenge, right? How do doctors predictably respond to a set of symptoms, even when the individual may in fact that might not be like quite the right fit? Like that's the challenge in healthcare delivery too. Um, so I think it's about being super clear on what's most important, which standards are most important, what do we want the quality of the experience to be, and like weirdly being okay with 90% rather than 100%, so that we actually have the flexibility to do all the other things that we want to do, like letting learners take some time to choose how they want to demonstrate mastery, like being able to, I mean, I think we forget that personalization is about more than just responding to academic need. It's about also acknowledging that humans' brains are motivated. We learn better when we are motivated. We learn better when we see things as relevant. We learn better when we are able to exert agency, and all of those like buttons are things we also want to push on in personalization too. And if we get so rigid, we actually lose our ability to personalize. And so I think it's about, unfortunately, having to be really clear on what we want the quality of experience to be, what our most important things are, and thinking about all of those elements that can actually get us more quickly to mastery. If I'm a kid, as a teacher, I very clearly remember using technology that was incredibly effective, but so boring. The kids would just slow down and spend an hour and a half on something that should have taken 5 minutes. Like that is a loss. And so we have to think about this in a systematic way. And we have to also, I mean, to respond to the last question, a way of like wasting time is to get to the wrong answer or the wrong outcome. And I think like there are a lot of technologies we can use that, including generative AI, that if we use them in the wrong way or a novice way, actually get us to a worse outcome. So we have to like have the ability to balance our time and to say like, what do we want learners to be able to know and do? And what are the different ways we can flex to getting there, while also just noting like this is still about group delivery and group experiences.
So, Scott, I want to bring you into the conversation because there's a question that I think you can also respond to what Beth just did. But it also says Scott talked about having the foundational structure necessary in order for mastery learning to be possible. What does that physically look like in the traditional classroom with the teacher engaging with multiple students? So, alluding to that group part that Beth just brought up. But also maybe bringing in the curriculum and assessment part that can appear standardized, but maybe doesn't have to be in how you reach it. So how do you think about that?
No, absolutely. And I think this links to the comments Beth made. If we want things to be deployed at scale, the more we can standardize, the more, frankly, it creates markets for software companies that are actually attractive, and they can build one product instead of 50, and then the economics work. And so we can think about that side of it. But what I think about a lot is the nuance in where the standardization and where the flexibility or customization is. And so I think it would be great if we could move toward more standardization in the learning objectives. What do we want students to know and be able to do? We want them to be able to multiply a one-digit number times a two-digit number. We want them to be able to do certain things in writing, reading, etc. And then how students learn, that should vary. And so there are different ways for individual students and individual teachers to get to a common endpoint. And so really helping to both create flexibility there, because we want the teaching and learning process to change. We want there to be different and better and more interesting ways to engage students, whether it's current events, whether it's a student who likes Steph Curry or LeBron James, whether students like wildlife projects instead. But all of these are things that can be used as part of helping them learn how to multiply to one-digit numbers, for example. And so let's think about standardizing the learning objectives and the definition of mastery, and then enabling flexibility and customization for how people learn and how people teach. And then I think in terms of how to bring it to life in a classroom, Kristen mentioned earlier the comment about someone's got to put a number in a grade book somewhere. Well, guess what? We've been doing this, a version of this, for a very long time. We have been teaching kids. We've been keeping track of what they learn in certain ways. And what I'm recommending is defining what we should have them learn and keeping track in a slightly different way. And it is as simple as saying, here's what the learning objectives are. Here's each student. Which student has mastered which learning objective? It's actually a very simple spreadsheet. And so I built my first platform. I raised a few $1 million. It was a full software platform with single sign-on, et cetera, et cetera. What I'm doing now is making everything in Google Sheets. So it's fully customizable. There's no rostering. People can make a copy, download it, et cetera, because bringing it to life in the classroom can be that simple. And then the teacher's job becomes every day looking at the data, seeing what the students know, and then using that to guide the instructional process, which in many ways is what educators have done for a long time. I remember talking to one educator about this, and she said, well, Scott, this is just backwards planning 101. And I said, I know, how come none of you are doing it? And she laughed, but that's a lot of the reality here. And so that's what it means to really bring this to life, is to first of all, make that choice and then use some of these tools to make it happen.
It's interesting also, I think, and this sort of relates to the origin story of how I knew I wanted Beth's voice in this book, which was been lots of models that have been personalizing with technology, not digital technology, but for decades and decades and decades. Even, Montessori, right, has been doing this for many, 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 many years, over 100. So, um, John, let me bring you in here because you mentioned a few examples of how AI has already recently changed. But the question is, how do you see AI adding to more personalization in schools? And do you see it being more helpful or hurtful as it continues to progress?
Um, well, so I think it's going to be both. It'll help and it'll hurt. I mean, it's just that's the general purpose technologies. The technologies generally always have upsides that you're trying to maximize and downsides, and we see that right now with the impact of technology eroding social connectedness. There's a lot is like we offload our mental tasks to AI. That could be great. We could do things very quickly, but when does it start substituting for human judgment? And just because it's easy, because we're tired, just human nature. So I see lots of, risks there. I'm so bullish on the upsides though. And I think to kind of get a sense of where I think this could play out in education, you have to look to healthcare. And there's been an enormous amount of research and some experiments recently using AI agents. The way of like thinking of an agent is thinking of like you create a little AI that has a specialty. And Google just did this recently where they created a series of agents that were essentially co-scientists working on solving a scientific problem. And what's amazing about that is you could give them subspecialties and expertise, but also there was a critic. And the critic, their whole task was to review the output of the other agents and give it feedback and criticize it for a whole bunch of different things about assumptions, about its quality output. But you put those agents to work, and all of a sudden they were coming up with some pretty amazing scientific breakthroughs. CZI had something similar with their bio network with something that was like actually working in sort of a lab scenario. But imagine that in education. Imagine like the teacher had a bunch of AI agents working on a lesson plan. One was a curriculum expert, one was a science of reading expert, the other was an expert on one student's IEP. Another was on the best ways of doing mastery learning. It was like a Scott expert. And then there was a critic expert. And they were all given the task of helping to solve for John Bailey and making math more accessible. That sounds like science fiction, but like we're seeing that play out. And like 2025 is going to be the year of the agents in a lot of respects. And all of a sudden, if you have those many expertise collaborating on a specific task that you give it, I think like that's pretty amazing. And that's very different than tutoring, right? That could be about keeping the humans in the loop. But you're all of a sudden that teacher's getting a supercharged lesson plan, activities, curriculum materials, all developed by their little team of agents. And again, it'll be clunky as it always is when it comes out, but definitely look up the Google Gemini co-assistant, and it's called the Co-Virtual Lab. Was came out of the CCI Bio Network, but it gives you a glimpse, I think, of what's on the horizon here and what's possible.
All right, we are nearing the top of the hour, so we're going to wrap up here. Lightning round for each of you to just like couple concluding thoughts, things that you hope people take from your chapters as they actually seek to do this work of reinvention on the ground. And at a time, I'll note, where like we really need to be working for a lot of kids who've been left behind, as we've seen in results, coming out of the pandemic, disengagement, whatever your indicator is. So maybe Kristen, Scott, Beth, John, each get a very quick final word.
On AI, I would say I will use a baseball analogy. We are not even in the first inning. We're like in batting practice of where things are right now. So I think first I would say ask people not to judge what is now as what will be in the future, and to be thinking about how can we innovate and how will we measure our success. And I think those are the two big things for us to think about in the world of AI.
Scott.
So I think a lot about transitioning from measuring teaching to measuring learning. And so the most important thing is to get the data about what the students know and then use that data to drive the entire teaching and learning process.
So I would say personalization is totally possible. It's doable. It's not one strategy, it's a constellation towards the aims of meeting individual needs. The second thing I'd say is like, we need to remember that joy is an outcome for humans. And in all of our solutions finding, if we remove that, we've lost what is most human about learning. And so we got to focus on that as much as we are on other things.
John, final word, bring the joy.
Oh my God, bring the joy. I know that's a hard setup right there. Well, one is like, I think we have to follow curves, and curves, the technology is going to get better much faster. So I think that curve is going up. The cost curve is going way down. It's this, the be able to access this technology is getting cheaper literally by the day, and will continue. You have to follow those curves out and think about, as this technology matures, how could we use it in all the different facets of teaching and learning, or just supporting the humans in the space. But two, this all comes back down to humans at the end. And it's that, Michael, it's what you brought up. It's the jobs to be done. What is the jobs to be done for this technology? But also, what's the systems change, and what are the ways we're going to support the real humans to think about this and to help manage that transition? So at the end of the day, it's about teaching, it's about learning, it's about students, it's about teachers. And if we don't center it there, then we run the risk of just chasing another tech a tech solution that's never really gonna make a difference. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think the chapters that you all wrote does a good job of getting into that nitty gritty and pointing out the pitfalls, where not to start, if you will, and what we need to get right on the ground. And frankly, the questions people ought to ask to say, is this right for me at this point in my own journey? So huge thank you, John Bailey, AEI, Beth Rabbitt, the Learning Accelerator, Scott Ellis, MasteryTrack, Kristen DiCerbo, Khan Academy, for joining us to talk about School Rethink 2.0, putting reinvention into practice. And thanks for all of you for joining us here on the AEI webinar.